Setting this up correctly.
Hello, everybody, and welcome. I'm Michelle Backus with Rutgers Cooperative Extension of Middlesex and Union County, and welcome to the first of our Earth Day Everyday webinar series for the spring of 2024, the elements of natural resource management. I am going to be your host this evening. So just a couple of housekeeping things before I turn it over to Jeremy, our speaker. First of all, I want to let you know, if you haven't joined us in the past, Rutgers Cooperative Extension is the outreach arm of Rutgers University. We are a partnership between the university and the counties that we serve. So every county in the state has a Rutgers Cooperative Extension office, and you can go to your extension offices to get all your questions answers. Our series this spring is on the elements of natural resource management, and we are taking a deep dive into looking at the role of natural elements. So we're talking about air, earth, fire, water, spirit, and wildlife, and how they play into natural resource management, and also what you can do. So I just want to let you know that the chat is probably disabled on your end, so you can put your questions in the Q&A that you see at the bottom of your screen. All right, if you could go to the next slide. Okay, so we always, folks know who have been with us before, we always do a survey or a poll as part of our webinar series. And this slide here basically just explains what your rights are. Rutgers considers this to be a research project and considers you all to be human subjects. So if you have any questions about that, you can reach out to the Rutgers Internal Review Board and human subjects compliance, and there's some contact information at the bottom of the screen. Okay, and the next slide. And then this is our And Justice for All poster, letting you know that Rutgers Cooperative Extension is an equal opportunity program provider and employer. And we do have a anti-discrimination policy that we take very seriously and abide by. And this is some of the information about that. Okay, next slide. Okay, so now I am very excited to introduce Jeremy Weber, who is with the division, who is the Division Forest Fire Warden with the New Jersey Forest Fire Service within the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection. Jeremy has his master's in forest resource management, and he was at the State Forest Fire Service for 8 years, but he is now with the Fire Service. And today he's going to be talking to you about the role of fire in ecosystem health and public safety in New Jersey's wildlands. So I'll pass it over to you, Jeremy. Oh, Jeremy, I think you are muted.
And I am on live now.
Oh,
Thanks, Michelle.
Yeah.
Thanks everyone this evening for joining us. Again, as Michelle was saying, I'm a Division Fire Warden with the New Jersey Forest Fire Service. I did have a brief stint with the Forest Service, the State Forest Service for 8 years prior to, and did some forest management. I worked in urban and community forestry and state and private lands as well. So got a little background on the green side of things, as we may say, before I went over to the fire side. So tonight we're going to talk about a few different things. We're going to talk about the history of fire in New Jersey from pre-colonial times up through current day. We're going to explore New Jersey's fire-dependent ecosystems, landscapes, and we're also going to look at the influence of fire on the landscape. We're also going to look at fire's role in habitat management, both flora and fauna, and we're going to look over a few objectives that are consistent across the management landscape, and then talk about some seasonal considerations when it comes to fire. A lot of things people don't realize try to point some of the shortcomings of different seasonalities with fire out. And then we're also going to talk about, good fire versus bad fire. Bad fire. Wildfire necessarily always isn't a bad fire, and prescribed fire not isn't always a good fire. If you want to know the truth of it, it all depends on a lot of the parameters that are in place and the fire effects that actually occur when the fire occurs. So first, the Native Americans were actually the first people to use fire in New Jersey. Research suggests that it was over 1,000 years the Lenape tribe used fire to, one, facilitate some travel, improve their hunting grounds, which also would increase their shooting lanes, but also increase their ability to supply browse and mass production from the trees and shrubs below, and also to drive away insects. Some research has been going around the last couple of years has shown fire to help reduce some tick populations. Maybe they were ahead of their time. Tick populations in New Jersey are hideous. Post-Native American fire use, once the Europeans came in, they used it for a little bit of a different use. They were basically trying to clear lands for home sites, town sites, and agriculture. So they went away from using fire as a tool on the landscape to adjust their needs to using fire as a tool to, so to speak, develop the land for their needs. In the 1750s, the first attempt to legally restrict the use of fire and promote fire detection was first recorded. In the 1920s, the cranberry and blueberry growers first used prescribed fire to protect their properties. New Jersey, especially in the Pinelands, has been noteworthy of being a fire-dependent ecosystem and has been sculpted by fire over centuries. So they understood that and began to use it as a way to protect their properties as well. In 1928, prescribed fire was first used to protect the first state forest. Initially, they started burning small safety strips along the sides of roads, and 25 to 200 foot length strips. We still do those practices somewhat today, but in the 1930s, they decided to expand those safety strips into larger blocks of woods to better treat the lands to protect the public from the threat of wildfire. Historically, the impact of fires across the landscape from 1924 to 2020, so almost 100 years there, you can get a pretty good visual of where the large major wildfires. So we consider large major fires as being fires between 100 acres for forested land and like 200, 300 acres for grass marshlands. And that's representation across the landscape in New Jersey. As you can see there's a lot of hits in the southern part of the state, from Ocean, a little bit in Monmouth, but mostly Ocean, Burlington, Atlantic, a little bit in Gloucester and Camden there, and it kind of tapers off as you get into Cape May. Cumberland's got a little bit there. That's European settlement from the 1920s to the 2020, the impact of fire. And in New Jersey, people always ask, well, how many fires are man-caused or caused by humans, anthropogenic? And the vast majority of fires across the landscape are human-caused. We occasionally do have lightning strike fires, and it's less frequent in the east because we typically have more rainfall that is given on every 5 to 7, 8 days. Whereas out west, they go through long periods where they don't have any rainfall. When they do have storms come through in the summer, they typically are dry lightning, and they light a lot of fires with those lightning strikes. Here, we don't really have that big of a problem. So normally it's about 1% or less, usually less than 1% of our fires are started by natural causes, such as lightning. So in this slide, we show the major fire frequency across the state of New Jersey. And again, there's a little speckling up north in the highlands and the Ridge and Valley area and the outer coastal plain. But what you do see again is in the outer coastal plain is the higher occurrence of fire and frequency of fire in those areas. So as a little summary for what you see across the state of New Jersey, this is the 2023 annual summary. Like I said before, lightning fires are typically rare, and last year we probably had more lightning fires in one year than we've had in recent history. As you can see on there, we have had 20 fires that were caused from lightning strikes. And there may be more out there, but a lot of the time, because the fuels are not so receptive, that you might get a lightning strike and a fire might start, but rain might fall upon it and put it out right away. And we never were able to record those fires because they were never actually found, but they were probably still in the landscape. But 20 that we found last year, and you can see some of the other causes: human caused campfire, smokers, debris burning, human, children, human. So prescribed fire in the state of New Jersey, we've since starting it in the early 20s, we're in our 96th year using prescribed fire to protect public open space. So that's quite a history in the state of New Jersey, and it's probably one of the longest histories in the union, to be honest with you. Prior to 2018, prescribed fire, the main use was primarily for hazard fuel reduction. So, which many of you are probably accustomed to from hearing on the news and time again to talk about, how prescribed fire is used to, reduce the fuels, reduce the flammability of the forest. So when there is a wildfire, it doesn't burn as intensely, and it gives firefighters the ability to, battle those fires safely in certain areas. And we typically try to go for those areas to focus on that are going to give us strategic advantage. So if a large block of woods is burning, and you have a path, that we try to create fuel breaks using prescribed fire to limit those fuels in front of some of those fires that could happen on any given day. And then in 2018, the Prescribed Burn Act was passed and signed by Governor Murphy into law. At that point, fire use using prescribed fire changed dramatically, at least in the law and the use of it. Before that, the primary use was for hazard fuel reduction, trying to reduce wildfires impacts. But after the Prescribed Burn Act, it also included the use of prescribed fire to also include habitat restoration, ecological burns. It widened the scope and the definition of prescribed fire to be more all-inclusive rather than just a fire protection standpoint. And that was a big win for not only the organization but for the state. So statewide, prescribed fire is a fluctuating system across the state. And here's some numbers that reflect a series of years. So the last 6 years, not including this, you see the numbers go up and down, up and down. And at the top there, you see 2018 is kind of highlighted. It was 6,400 acres that were burned that year. And then you go to the next year's 28,000 and 26 and 17 and 16 and 22. Mother Nature dictates how much prescribed fire we can put on the landscape. And in any given year, we are, at her mercy to be able to do our best at putting fire on the ground. This year has been an exceptionally wet year too, and I think we've somehow made it to 14,000 acres treated thus far. And we're, for the most part, through our prescribed burn season. We will get into a few more burns up in our northern part of the state. But down in the central and southern part of the state, we tend to focus or shift our resources to fire protection and suppression efforts. So let's talk about some of New Jersey's fire adapted landscapes. The first one that you can all imagine is one that's in everybody's eyes and they hear about all the time. It's the Pinelands National Reserve, the 1.1 million acre tract of land that's it's a quasi-state federal reserve, and it's protects the pine barrens and the Coyancy aquifer. It's located on the outer coastal plain, and it encompasses 56 municipalities or parts of 56 municipalities across the state and 7 counties. Some of those characteristics in the pinelands are those low, dense pine and oak forests with bands of Atlantic white cedar and hardwood swamps that run through them. In the picture to the right there, you can see where there was a fire. I think it was a Spring Hill fire, and you can see that band of Atlantic white cedar and hardwood swamp that kind of checked the fire up there. It's a little darker tinge in the color between the brown, the black, and the lighter green, which is the pine. The sandy drought-prone soils are the reason why we have the pine barrens. That's why pitch pine and post oaks and a lot of the scrub oak, a lot of those species thrive in the pinelands because they are adapted to these droughty conditions. Within the pinelands, there's approximately 850 species of plant species out there, with the dominant trees being pitch pine, black, white, scarlet, and chestnut oaks, with a mix of scrub oak, Mount Laurel, inkberries, and several varieties of heath and mixed into that. And the other part of the state that what a lot of people probably don't realize that's actually fire adapted is the mixed oak forest of the northern part of the state, the Valley and Ridge, the Highlands, and the Piedmont. There are actually some occurrences of pitch pine up in the Valley and Ridge area, and a lot of these areas are dominated by that mixed oak forest, which do have a lot of fire adapted traits as well. And the historical fire regime in this area, it may not be quite as frequent as what you would be accustomed to down in the Pinelands or the Pine Barrens area, but it's estimated that the historical fire regime is anywhere from 35 to 200 years between intervals. So that's 35 years seems like a lot, but you also have to take into place, where these areas are. A lot of these places have northern exposures where they don't dry out. The topography really creates a much different landscape. So the frequency of those fires is probably right on. I mean, 35 is probably a good number. You think of like last year where we hit a drought and we went on months and months and months without having a lot of rain impact our areas. And then, or that was, I guess it was 2 years ago, and it kind of went back into the fall again. Last spring was pretty dry. Those peaks and valleys of, wet at times and then dry times, when you do get a lightning strike in those historically, those dry times when they did happen, that was probably when those occurrences of historical fires occurred in those areas. So some of the fire adapted traits of oaks, Morgan Varner and a few other researchers looked at the flammability of litter, burning and drying, and a few different other aspects there to categorize things in. I think it was like 8 or 9 oaks that they looked at. Now, these were southeastern oaks, but some of those oaks do occur in New Jersey. So in the literature that in their discussion at the end, they basically said, white oak group, so Quercus alba, and a few of the other oak groups that are or species that are also in there that they discussed could be extrapolated into the northern part of the country as well. So turkey oak is one of them, falcata, indica was another one. There's a species, but what they were looking at was the paraphytic uh, traits of some of these oak species. And some of those traits that they were looking at were that flammability, the ability for those leaves to dry and to burn, both for their chemical physiology and also the physiological growth of those species. And then they also looked at the protective traits, the bark thickness and the ability for those trees to respond to wounds that could be inflicted from fire. So it's a very very interesting study that took into a lot of things different account. So some of the mesophytic oaks that were studied in there, the ones that typically have faster growth rates, they were less fire adapted than some of the slower growing oaks that we see on the landscape, say in New Jersey. So like the post oaks, the white oaks, what they found in the southern red oak, the falcata. Um, these these oak species are much slower growing, but they also have that protective bark, a thick protective bark, and they're very good at compartmentalizing their wounds, healing them up. So there was a trade-off for that fast growth versus the ability to treat your wounds and prevent yourself from getting wounds, which I thought was an interesting observation that they made in their paper. So some of the other fire adaptions that we know occur across the landscape, uh, pitch pine, they have serotinous cones. Not all pitch pine are serotinous, but some of them are serotinous, and we believe that helps ensure their presence on the landscape. Pitch pines also has the ability for basal sprouting, which is spouting from within the root collar after a fire. So you could have top kill of the species, and then you could have epicormics come out of the root collar and sprout and regrow another tree. And then pitch pine also is notorious for having that thick bark and an aerated fuel bed. So when pine needles fall and they lace themselves on the ground, there's a lot of air that gets in there. So when fire does start, it can happen really quick after a rain event that the pitch pine forest with that haystack pitch intertwining of those needles is much more receptive than say an oak dominated or a hardwood swamp dominated area because the way that leaf litter and the fuel bed is arranged. Now on the other side with the oak species, they have a lot of the similar same traits as pitch pine. They have that root collar sprouting they're able to do. They have that thick bark, a lot of them do. And what people don't know or realize that some of those species like white oak and like the scarlet oak and the falcata, that when the it begins to dry, the leaves actually begin to curl and create that air porosity. So it allows air to get in and help dry, but also carry the fire a lot better. When you have fuels that just lay on top of each other and they're flat, that doesn't really give a very receptive bed because there's not a lot of air getting in. And what fire needs is it needs that heat, it needs the fuel, and it needs oxygen to be able to breathe and to really get going. So what they found in Morgan's study and some of the other examinations of oak species is that there is a really unique curling of leaves as those fuels begin to dry that gives them the ability to become more flammable, which I thought was really unique. It doesn't happen as fast as it does with pitch pine, just because the pitch pine has the lacing of the needles, and it's a lot quicker to get that drying effect. But it does have its own fire adaptation, and there's also that quick closure of wounds we talked about before, and that the flammability of that litter. So how does that all play into habitat management, fire as a tool? So when you start thinking about fire as a tool to manage an ecosystem or to manage fire risk, you got to first come up with your objectives. And then, to know what those objectives are, then you got to start understanding before that what the benefits of fire can be to fully utilize its potential. And then also have the seasonal considerations of fire. Different seasons affect fire's behavior in different ways. And then we'll move on to some case studies if we have time. So talking about management objectives. So, the one that I hold dear to me is reducing fire risk, because that's really our bread and butter with the fire service is putting out fires and getting our firefighters in areas that are safer to work in. And then there's enhancing the habitat and plant diversity across the landscape. Sometimes fire is able to be used as a cover manipulator. So that not only isn't reducing fire risk by consuming some of those fine fuels that wildfires like to consume beforehand, but it also manipulates the cover to create openings in the landscape, areas for like red-headed woodpecker to be able to forage. So like red-headed woodpeckers need areas that are more open in the forest understory. So repeated prescribed fire or wildfire in an area can create a more park-like aesthetic appeal, which is more beneficial to certain species like red-headed woodpecker that like areas that are more open. They can fly in, they can forage, do their thing. Fire can be used to maintain grasslands and increase the forage, like we talked about with the lenape. And then it can be used to improve the structure of the habitat. Sometimes you need a mosaic of different types of habitats across the landscape, and fire is a tool that you can use to help create those mosaics across the landscape. And it can also be used to help remove undesirable plants, such as invasives. And I would like to say fire is a tool that is effective, and it is, but I think for the invasive and undesirable plant communities, I think fire is only a tool, and a lot of time it must be used in conjunction with another tool to increase its effectiveness on the landscape. So in habitat management, you need to start first and ask yourself, what is our objective? So what is the severity and the occurrence of fire that we need on landscape? So a lot of the time people think of like severity as being a real intense fire has, 100-foot flame lengths. It's just plowing through the forest and, approaching on homes. Well, a very severe fire can have 6-inch flame lengths. And people probably don't realize that, because the severity is how it changes the landscape. And sometimes those fast moving wildfires, they at least in the pine barrens, they don't really change the landscape as much as you might think. They might burn the trees and turn them black, but these fire adapted trees are very resilient, and they can withstand some pretty intense fire. But on a really hot day with fire that's burning through very slowly through the understory, it can actually do more damage to the stand than a very intense fire, just because of the residency time of that fire on the bark of different fuels of different species. So, think about, what the fuels are, what are the weather conditions and firing techniques that you need to accomplish those objectives to manage that habitat. Again, do you need a fast moving fire or do you need a slow moving fire? Do you need a fire that's in the fall or the spring? Or, there's a bunch of different scenarios that you have to evaluate to determine what kind of fire you need to accomplish those objectives. And as we're going to talk about a little bit, what season and how long after the previous fire do you need to take into consideration when you're managing that habitat? So the seasonality, we'll get into a deeper dive here in a few minutes. But you also have to think about, again, fire is only one tool in the toolbox. What other treatments are going to help enhance your benefits? So one of the things that we do in some of these really dense forests that are up against communities, we'll actually go in and pre-treat the fuels with a masticator or some saws to try to reduce the stems per acre and the canopy and reduce the ladder fuels in those areas so that when we do put prescribed fire in those areas that it's more predictable and manageable, it's safer to do. So some of the benefits of fire to wildlife, the Indians actually touched on a lot of that early on. And, they were before their time. They were putting into practice things that we're thinking and talking about now. They were reducing that leaf litter for on the floor to reduce insects and exposing insects too in some cases. Um, New germination of flowering grasses and legumes and other herbaceous plants follow fire that harbor insects and produce seeds that are beneficial to different game birds. Um, a lot of shrubs and different plant species are more prone to produce fruity or mast after a fire, either the year after or a couple years after, because fire increases the amount of nutrients that's available into the soil and allows that plant to get a kind of a jump start or a liquid IV into their root system. And then a lot of young hardwoods, a lot of the oak species, and even some of the maple species are able to sprout back after a fire, utilizing some of the stored energy systems in the root mass, but also those nutrients that become available after a fire as well. And then the low ground cover and patches that are typically in frequently burned areas. So um, here's an example. Frequent burning of an area or a heavy or severe fire could create an area that's very exposed and open to the sun, and reduce a lot of the understory that's there. Some of that would be very beneficial to like pine snakes in the pine barrens because they like to bask. You can create habitat in the forest and help keep some of these pine snakes from going out into the road and trying to bask themselves in the sun by creating those habitats inside the forest so they don't have to go out into the roads and get hit by a car, people not paying attention when they're driving down the roads. Some fire prescriptions that the North Carolina Forest Service had put out for some of the I guess mostly game and some songbirds and shrubland songbirds there. So white-tailed deer, 3 to 5 years, improves that browse production, nutrition. We talked about northern bobwhite, which we're still struggling trying to attempt to get some bobwhite up here again, but it improves the nesting and feeding cover, and it's a crucial part of their habitat and their system. They have to have fire to be able to flourish, otherwise they just get pushed out. Wild turkeys, they improves their nesting and field feeding cover. Songbirds, again, a lot of these are very beneficial aspects to a lot of different wildlife. Now, there's obviously always concerns anytime you have fire moving through a landscape. But the one thing to note in a lot of the fires that occur are in the, even a lot of the wildfires that occur are in the dormant season. And the vast majority of prescribed fire occurs during the dormant season. So a lot of these risks or concerns are mitigated because a lot of these species are either in hibernation or they're not uh they're not real active at that time. So like small mammals like turtles and stuff, they may not be coming out of their hibernation yet. And same with snakes. So let's move on to talking about some seasonal considerations of fire. So during the winter, there's a higher ground fuel moisture present. Like this year, it's like off the chart. I think I'm 21 inches of rain for the year so far since January. That's it's unheard of. It's like half a year's rain already in 4 months. So winter, you got this higher ground fuel moisture typically because the trees have desiccated their leaves and they're not active at this time. So the groundwater level is actually able to replenish itself and begin to rise. And as you see this year, there's standing water everywhere. Energy storage is still beneath the ground. The trees haven't exposed or um, pushed out any kind of energy resources to leaf out yet. So they're still very vigorous and intact. The open canopy and shrub layer is exposed, so you have good drying of the forest fuels. So you can actually treat treat fuels in a relatively quick manner as you compared to you would in the say summer after a leaf out, because the sun is drying the fuel bed out in a quicker scenario, and a lot of the wind is actually getting down to the ground, which helps push some of these fires through the stands. And then typically in the winter, we have pretty good air quality and dispersion rates. As you've seen the last few days, we had a lot of wind. Too much wind is bad, but actually wind is very beneficial to fire and helping fire move across the landscape for that good fire. And it can be too much during, events where you have wildfires, where it's bad fire. We have cooler, drier ambient air temperatures, lower relative humidities. Um, what that does is it keeps the cambiums of the boles of the tree and the crown scorch on pine trees or conifer trees from becoming too bad. The higher those temperatures raise, the more susceptible to uh, the cambium being boiled, so to speak, and killing that tissue and basically girdling the tree from that point on, or too much heat into the crowns. So it's typically limited tree mortality. However, in the spring, you still have that higher ground fuel moisture, but the water starts getting sucked out and you start getting that stem water flow. It's trying to start moving, it's starting to pop the buds um, and begin that flowering process. So fire in the winter, going back to the last slide, um, it doesn't usually have a huge impact on the system itself. When you start getting into the spring and summer and fall, fire can impact the system that you're in much more substantially, because once you start using the reserves, like leafing out, when you have a fire come through and it boils that cambium and it kills those shrubs, um, it can have an effect of opening up that understory for a longer period of time because you use some of those reserves to help leaf and flower the plants, and then the fire comes in and knocks it back, at least for the woody vegetation. The fire comes in and knocks it back. And since it used a lot of those reserves to flower and leaf out, it has less to like re, uh, reinvigorate itself and then sprout back and jump back. So canopy and the shrub layer are typically incomplete in the spring. Um, so there's still a little bit of sun getting down on the ground. It helps drive the fire a little bit, but the wind's starting to get impacted. And what we call the wind at the ground level is the in-stand wind speed. So it begins to decrease because there's more leaves and it's creating a barrier for it to help push those fires through those landscapes. Typically, you still have pretty good air quality and dispersion rates. One of the things we look at is um, how good is the air quality? What's the forecast for the day? What are we currently in? And you know, how is that smoke going to get dispersed? Is it going to get good lift? Is it got a good mixing height where it goes up to 1,600 feet or higher, and then mixed into the atmosphere and disperses evenly? Or is it going to be one of those days where it's not good dispersion? You can't burn an area, or you can't burn as big of an area because the dispersion is going to be holding you back from being able to do that and not impacting the people around you. Warmer and dry ambient temperatures are prevalent and increased susceptibility to stem and crown scorch. Kind of talking about that knocking it back a little bit. So in the summer, we talk about those decreased fuel and moisture turfing. So all summer long, the plants are pulling out. And sometimes it's really wet, sometimes it's not though. But the plants are pulling out a lot of that moisture out of the soil. And then when a fire does occur, it tends to like burn really deep, and it burns down into the root systems of those trees and those shrubs and plants. And that can be much more impactful and have higher severity than a high intense fire could in the spring or wintertime. Air quality becomes typically a problem in the summer months, and typically becomes more hot and humid. So whenever it gets real hot and humid, usually air quality kind of trickles out, and it's going to limit the ability to put fire down without impacting the people around those fires. Stem and crown scorches more likely. We talked about the increased ambient air, and then along with the fire, it's going to have higher severity on those trees in that area. And then in the fall, it's even more so. You get limited ground fuel moisture, so the soils are really dry in the fall, and they're like you get a fire, and it's just going to keep burning and burning and burning into the ground. It may not be on top, but it's going to smolder and chew up those root systems and chew up those vascular systems at the base of those trees, and you'll have a lot of mortality with fires in the dry fall time. Mother Nature sometimes is wet in the fall too, so it's all relative. But typically, we think of the fall as being pretty dry because all summer long the trees and shrubs have just sucked the moisture out of the soil. So start getting those cooler and drier temperatures, but and a little intermittent stem and crown scorch. But typically widespread spread tree mortality, and that's because of those water reserves and the organic and soil layer have been decimated. So we're going to move on and start talking about some case studies. We'll talk about chaff seed, a couple burns in Peak West, Powhatan Country Farm, Audubon Hibernian Sanctuary, Washington Valley Park, and Whiting Wildlife Management Area. So first, we're going to talk about chaff seed. So chaff seed is a fire-dependent species, and it prefers that sandy, acidic, seasonally moist soils. And I believe, I'm not sure if it's the furthest north of its range, but there are very few sites still in New Jersey that have chaff seed. And they typically like that sunny to partly sunny area, but they like frequent fires. And talking to people down in North Carolina where chaff seed is more prevalent, they say they like that growing season fire more so than a dormant season fire. So with chaff seed being very imperiled in the state, we've worked with some partners with Natural Lands Management in the Raritan Valley to do some work to see if we can bounce back chaff seed a little bit in a couple of these sites. And one of the sites we did prescribed burning, but before we did the burning, we did some shrub and tree removal of the site, and then compounded it with some fire as well. So what we found at that site is after we burned it in March, during the dormant season burn, we still had a major increase in the Schwabia stems that were on site and a dramatic increase in the flowering that occurred on those stems, like 1,000% as post-treatment. That's a huge spike. Um, Now we can't attribute all to the fire because there was other treatments there, but I truly think that the nutrients that were released during that prescribed burn from those fuels on the ground, whether it be part of the trees that were cut or some of the shrubs and the fine fuels, gave that Schwabia a really good jump and head start, able to do that flowering, increase its ability to keep regenerating itself. Next example was up in the Highlands of Pequest, Powhatan Tree Farm. This was a fire that was done in I think it was like mid-spring, and so it was in the first part of the growing season. And this fire was it just didn't turn out to be a really good day. It turned out sunny to start, and then the clouds come in, and it was fighting us all day. So when we finally did get fire on the ground, it burned, but it didn't burn with a vengeance. It burned just it's almost we were having struggle trying to keep it going in places. So it was just this little tiny fire that was burning, 5, 6 inches all over me, mosaic and across part of the landscape. And at first we're like, man, we're not sure if it's going to accomplish the objectives. Because part of the objective was to reduce some of this shade tolerant species, like the beech that was on site. Well, when they came back in the summer, what they saw and realized was a lot of that beech, because of that thin bark, was knocked back and killed. And what we thought might have been not a success actually turned out to be, a partial success because a lot of that beech was put back in its place and allowed room for those, more mass species like the oaks to establish and keep growing on the site more healthy. The next one is we're talking about is New Jersey Audubon at Berkeley Township in Ocean County, the Hovnanian Sanctuary. So they did a lot of work here, and they're trying to make a pine savanna. They've been fighting this scrub oak time and time again. They can't get rid of it. So last spring, we went in there in May and we did a growing season burn. And I just talked to the fire warden that was in charge of the burn, and he went out there this past week, and he was like, there's stuff starting to sprout back, but it's not the scrub oak. And I went out there and trudged around through it, and a lot of those stems I could break. So that growing season burn, or that early spring burn, really did a good job of and you can see on the left, that was when they burned it. They was just starting to, you know, uh, break out and leaf out. So they were using reserves. So what happened is they used some of those reserves up, and it set the scrub oak back. So I'm really excited to go back this summer and um, take some more photos of it, because exactly what we are looking to do is set back the understory so that we can try to get more grasses in there. Next one is New Jersey Piedmont, Washington Valley Park in Somerset County. So this area had a lot of Japanese barberry. You can kind of see it in the left-hand side there, stringy, liney stuff. So this was a growing season burn too, and this was a project for landscape restoration that we were embarked in. And what happened was we had a really good kill of that barberry. It really set the barberry back. So, the objective in this case was to, reduce barberry by using a growing season burn. And that barberry was set back at the site as a result of that growing season burn. And then I think this is our last one, the growing season burn at Whiting Wildlife Management Area back in 2018. So, we talked about how fire used during the growing season can, set some of these fuels back for a long period of time or even permanently in that case. And that was kind of the point, what we were trying to do here. We were trying to reduce those hazard fuels and create more open habitat um, at the spot and try to reduce the number of return intervals that we had to do on the site by trying to put a prescribed burn through the summer to really knock back that vegetation on the ground and the ladder fuels for a longer period of time than it would if we put it in a treatment in during the dormant season. And that's exactly what happens there too. It reduced the interval that needs to be returned to the site. So, kind of bringing it all back. So are all wildfires bad? So everybody thinks is a wildfire is like just a horrible thing. Well, what people don't realize that wildfires are bad, but they're actually good for the ecosystem in some of these fire adapted communities because they create that mosaic across the landscape. And this is a great photo of that mosaic. You have scorched brown, black ground, then you have like some other trees that are, just they're scorched as well. But those trees are probably gonna pop back. And the ones that are in the swamps, they're still protected because they're still in a wet area. So what they do is they create multiple different habitats across the landscape rather than just kind of keeping a uniform heterogeneity of habitat across the landscape. So when a wildfire in the summertime or in the fall burns down and gets into the soil and turfs it out, what it does is it creates a seed bed that becomes exposed that was never exposed, even if it is a fire prone area from prescribed fire. If it's just done in a dormant season, you're not getting that seed bed exposed because you're burning when the soils are wet enough that it doesn't keep consuming and turfing into the soil. But when you have a wildfire go through and it is really dry, it exposes that sand mineral soil, and there's a lot of seeds that are hidden in there, and they're hidden there for like years and decades sometimes. And when the fire gets down, it actually can expose them, and you'll get some of these rare plants that'll pop back up that have just been suffocated and waiting for the light to happen again. So uh, it's one of those things that, it's probably a touchy subject with some people, but fire, not all wildfire is bad fire. As long as it doesn't burn down people's houses and stuff, there's a lot of goods to the ecosystem that occur from wildfires. In some cases, not in all cases, but I think that mosaic across the landscape is what we need for a healthy ecosystem in the state. So at that, I will go to questions, and I'm probably 5 minutes past or 10 minutes past where I was supposed to be.
No, this is perfect, actually. Thanks, Jeremy. Okay, folks, so I've launched the poll, and while Jeremy is answering questions, if you could please go ahead and answer those poll questions. In addition, if you could put any questions that you have in the Q&A, I see they're already coming in hot and heavy. We already had a bunch. All right, so Jeremy, there's have been some questions about invasive plants. Does fire get to the roots of invasives, or does it just remove the plant and allow the plant to regenerate?
So again, that all depends on the seasonality and the severity of the fire. So in some cases, so using prescribed fire, we try not to burn using prescribed fire when the soil conditions are too dry, because what happens when it is too dry is that it keeps burning deeper and deeper into the soil, and it what we call turfs, and it smolders. Well, that smolder is really hard to put out, and it creates a lot of incomplete combustion. It creates a smoke nuisance in the area, and you can try to put the stuff out, and it's just impossible to do 100% mop up. So typically with prescribed fire, we won't burn to that point where you can burn into the root system to kill those invasives. But again, if you try to target your approach using prescribed fire while you have that elevated soil moisture, hitting it after that invasive, like either just leaves out, so it used those energy reserves it had in its root system to knock it back, or hitting the invasive, depending on how its phenology is, before it goes to seed. So knock that invasive. So if it's like stilt grass, hit that stilt grass before it goes to seed, so that it doesn't have that seed bed. And there's still going to be a seed bed in the ground, so you're going to have to, again, try to get in there again. Probably not with just with fire, but with some other means of manipulation to try to knock it back. Because once you use fire in the landscape, in some cases, if it's really grassier, you could probably re-enter the next year if there's enough fuel. But if there's not enough fuel to carry the fire across, it's going to be really hard to use fire again in a lot of these sites, year after year. It's usually going to be a year, maybe 2 or 3 after that, you'll be able to re-enter.
Okay, okay, that's really interesting. So if I could just follow up then, so something like stilt grass is an annual, um, so, so are there certain species that respond better to, is there certain invasive species that respond better to fire management? Or are there ones that you kind of wouldn't even bother trying?
Well, like I said, so still grass will respond to fire, and it will respond to a point because there's such a seed bed there, um, that it's going to take multiple entries of not just fire, but some other tool in the toolbox to try to combat it. That's why they're invasive, because they are very good at like being opportunist on sites. Um, in the case of like Japanese barberry, if you hit barberry after you have leaf out right away, and you have another reentry again a couple years later, and you can keep knocking back that root system until you deplete it to the point where it's unable to continue to live.
Okay, okay. All right, so some other questions. Can you determine which years past fire have occurred from reading the growth rings of a tree?
Yeah, you can. So that's called dendrochronology, and um, it's not always available on all trees, but trees that are scarred by fire, and it's typically like the uphill side or an area where it's has a lot more fuel pooled in it, so it burns longer and it scars the tree. Um, you can see that in the ring of the tree, when you cut it through. So if you cut the tree down, you could actually see where those scars are. You can actually count the fire intervals that happened. And that's how they typically do the historic fire interval for different areas of the country, because trees are very long lived, and in some areas where trees, weren't harvested, and um, you have a long record of fire occurrence across the landscape.
Okay. Um, More invasive questions. Does exposed seed beds open up the land for invasive plants to grow as well? So I guess the question is, when you open up these areas, is there a potential for more invasive plants to move in?
And there is, and that's part of it, is like, having the timing and knowing what you're dealing with. So in some cases, you may not want to put fire down because it might make things worse. In other cases, it may not have that much there, and you might actually get a really good effect from fire. So I think the knowledge of what works and what doesn't is still best, is still like, being fine tuned. But I think if we follow uh, some really good guidelines and rules, basically looking at phenology and understand the stein dynamics and how much light's getting down to the ground, and what the severity of the fire you're looking for it to have on the site, and how much more light it's going to expose, and is it going to get down to the mineral soil. um, a lot of those different factors are going to play on how plants and different plants respond.
Okay. I know you discussed this in your talk, but the protecting wildlife when you do a prescribed burn, um, are there methods that you use to protect wildlife?
I'm sorry, is there what we use?
Are there methods that you use to protect wildlife?
So Again, a lot of our burns happen in the dormant season where a lot of like songbirds and stuff aren't actually around yet. So ground nesting birds, we try to avoid seasons that, ground nesting birds would be impacted. Um, as far as like snakes, again, a lot of, especially in the pine barrens, a lot of mammals and uh, amphibians, so to speak, they're very resilient and they've grown up in these fire adapted ecosystems. So, there may be some mortality across the larger population, but what you're doing is you're creating better habitat so that remaining population can thrive. Because if you leave habitat, so you can't just walk away from forests and expect everything to all be hunky-dory. There has to be disturbance in that forest to retain a lot of these different species, whether it's flora or fauna across the landscape. Everything being left alone ends up still changing because the forest still grows, it still does its thing, and certain species are going to get crowded out, and it's not going to be favorable conditions for them. So again, it's better to manage for that mosaic across the landscape.
Okay. When you look at maps of species richness across the United States, New Jersey is always one of the highest ones for species diversity and plant diversity, and I guess this is why. Okay,
That's
yeah, go ahead.
it's an intersection of like some of the southern species and northern species, and it's a very diverse geological area between the outer coast plain, the inner coast plain. It's got Piedmont, it's got the highlands,
Right.
the ridge and valley. So it's got a lot of diversity in such a small state. It's really remarkable.
It is, yeah. I was just out in Colorado and it's wonderful there, but they don't have, they have like three tree species.
Yeah.
Okay, so what's the advantage of some questions about chaff seed? What's the advantage of chaff seed on the forest floor over the existing understory? And also, if you could also explain why chaff seed is a fire adapted species, what about it specifically?
So again, all the literature suggests that chaff seed is fire dependent.
Dependent, right? Dependent.
Yeah, dependent. So it needs that fire, and it's probably because that nutrient influx and fire helps keep some of the competition around it at bay. So a lot like that growing season fire we were talking about, growing season fires are typically really good at reducing competition at the forest floor. And chassis is probably really good at utilizing that niche that fire helps create.
Okay. All right. Then a question, do you coordinate prescribed burns with other organizations that might have insights into plants and animals and bird species, or may know where the species are more vulnerable?
Yep. So we have an internal process within the state that we kind of review every site that we're going to burn beforehand, and we talk with the plant specialists and natural lands. We talk to the non-game species and Division of Fish and Wildlife program. We look at cultural historic resources. We look at the forest resource itself. We have several different groups that weigh in on it and try to help us guide us in our prescriptions to help alleviate or mitigate any concerns for threatened and endangered species or rare communities.
Okay. Um, how does one get a forested area evaluated to see if a controlled burn would be appropriate?
Um, well, I would suggest that you first, if you have forested land, that you first start looking at how you can manage that land and develop a forest stewardship plan for that land. Have a certified consulting forester, look at that land, assess it, determine, what you have, and get an inventory of it. And then he's going to help probably give you recommendations based on what your objectives are as a landowner. And he might guide you into saying fire is a tool that you might utilize in this plan.
Okay, so a forest stewardship plan would be the first step.
Yeah, that's what I would recommend. Just so that you have an assessment of what your forest is, and you can have some guidance from a professional to help manage for your objectives, rather than just saying, "Hey, can you come burn my property?" Well, yeah, we can come burn it, but why would we burn it? If we burn it to just reduce the fuels for fire's sake, then that's an objective, right? But if you're looking for other objectives, then you probably want to consult with a professional to develop a plan for your property first.
All right, so we are gone over time here. Thank you folks for taking the poll. I appreciate that. I'm gonna go ahead and end the poll. Jeremy, thank you so much. That was great. I just want to remind everybody that we have lots of other webinars coming up next week. April 24th is Hooked on Environmental DNA. This is our water element, reeling in community scientists for fisheries monitoring of offshore wind development with Dr. Jason Adolph and Erin Conlon from Monmouth University. So please join us next week. I also want to let everyone know that although these webinars are free, you can donate to our program to help support these webinars so that we can continue doing them. And you can do that right on the Rutgers Environmental Stewards website. I will put the link in the chat box. All right, and that's it. Thank you again, Jeremy, and everybody have a good evening.